December 20th, 1943. The sky above Germany is a killing field. American B-17 bomber pilot Charlie Brown is bleeding from shrapnel wounds, his co-pilot slumped unconscious beside him. Half his crew is dead or dying. 3 of his 4 engines are damaged or destroyed. The tail section is so shredded you can see through it. His bomber, christened Ye Olde Pub, is barely flying, more falling with style than actual controlled flight. Below him, German Luftwaffe pilot Franz Stigler has just refueled and rearmed. He's 1 kill away from earning the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor. His commander's words echo in his mind. You follow the rules of war for you, not for your enemy. You fight by rules to keep your humanity. Franz looks up, sees the crippled B-17 limping across the sky. An easy kill. The medal is within reach. He makes a decision that will haunt him for 46 years. This is not a story about heroes and villains. It's a story about 2 men on opposite sides of a war who for 27 minutes chose humanity over orders. It's about honor existing in a dishonorable time. And it's about the impossible friendship that bloomed from that choice nearly half a century later. This is the story of the enemy who refused to kill. Charlie Brown didn't dream of being a warrior. He grew up in Weston, West Virginia, the son of a grocer. In 1941, when America entered the war, he was 21 years old and studying to be a lawyer. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps not from bloodlust, but from the same reason millions of young men enlisted, because his country asked. Flight training transformed him. The B-17 Flying Fortress became his world. 4 engines, 10 machine guns, a crew of 10 men whose lives depended on split-second decisions made at 25,000 feet. By late 1943, he was a 2nd lieutenant piloting bombers out of England as part of the 8th Air Force. The statistics were brutal. In 1943, the average life expectancy of a B-17 crew member was 15 missions. The Army Air Force required 25 missions to complete a tour of duty. The math was simple and terrifying. Most crews didn't survive. Charlie's crew, 10 young men, most barely out of their teens, understood this math. But understanding and accepting are different things. Each mission began with hope that today wouldn't be the day, that today the odds would favor them, that today they'd make it back to base for dinner and terrible coffee, and the chance to do it all again tomorrow. December 20th, 1943, was their first mission together as a complete crew. The target was a Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, Germany. Intelligence estimated it was defended by 15 flak batteries, anti-aircraft guns capable of filling the sky with exploding metal. The plan was straightforward. Fly in formation with 300 other B-17s, drop bombs on the factory, fly home. Simple. Except nothing about bomber operations over Germany in 1943 was simple. The formation began breaking up almost immediately. Weather scattered the bombers. Navigation errors sent groups in different directions. By the time they reached Bremen, Charlie's bomber was separated from the main force, part of a smaller group of about 50 aircraft. The flak batteries opened up. The sky filled with black puffs, each one a shell exploding, sending shrapnel in all directions. The shells were timed to explode at specific altitudes designed to tear through aluminum fuselages and human bodies with equal efficiency. Charlie's bomber took a direct hit. Shrapnel tore through the nose section, killing the navigator instantly. The co-pilot was knocked unconscious. More shells hit the fuselage, wings, tail. 1 engine caught fire. Then another failed. The aircraft began falling, but the worst wasn't over. As they dropped out of formation, German fighter planes, Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s, swarmed them. These were some of the best fighter aircraft of the war, flown by experienced Luftwaffe pilots who'd been hunting American bombers for years. The fighters attacked in waves. Machine gun and cannon fire raked the bomber from nose to tail. The ball turret gunner in the belly of the aircraft was hit and killed. The tail gunner took shrapnel and couldn't move. The waist gunners were wounded. Every pass from the German fighters added more holes, more damage, more blood. Charlie fought to keep the bomber in the air, fought to keep it level enough that his crew had a chance. His co-pilot Spencer "Pinky" Luke regained consciousness and tried to help, though he was concussed and could barely see straight. Together they wrestled with controls that were increasingly unresponsive, flying an aircraft that by all engineering logic should have already come apart. Then something remarkable happened. The German fighters broke off their attack. They'd seen fighters do this before, run out of ammunition and return to base to reload. But this time felt different. The Germans weren't coming back. Charlie didn't understand why. His bomber was defenseless, crippled, barely flying. They were an easy kill. But the fighters disappeared into the clouds and didn't return. What Charlie didn't know was that another German fighter pilot had just spotted his dying bomber. And that pilot was about to make a choice that defied every military logic, every wartime instinct, every rational calculation of advantage and duty. Franz Stigler's path to that moment began decades earlier, in a very different Germany. He was born in 1915, just as World War I consumed Europe. His childhood was shaped by Germany's defeat and the crushing terms of the Treaty of Versailles. He grew up in a country struggling with hyperinflation, political chaos, and collective humiliation. Aviation became his escape, a way to rise above the limitations of a defeated nation. By the early 1930s, Franz was flying gliders with German aviation clubs. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from maintaining an air force, so these sports clubs became the training ground for what would eventually become the Luftwaffe. When Hitler officially reconstituted the German Air Force in 1935, Franz was ready. But Franz's aviation heritage ran deeper than Nazi rearmament. His older brother August had been a fighter pilot in World War I. August taught Franz not just how to fly, but how to think about flying, the physics, the tactics, the split-second decisions that separated living pilots from dead ones. More importantly, August taught Franz about honor, about fighting by certain rules even when war itself seemed to destroy all rules, about maintaining humanity even in a profession dedicated to killing. August Stigler died in combat in 1940, shot down over France. But his lessons stayed with Franz, as did the words of Franz's commanding officer Gustav Rödel. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. You follow the rules of war for you, not for your enemy. You fight by rules to keep your humanity." By December 1943, Franz had been flying combat missions for 3 years. He'd flown in North Africa under Erwin Rommel, shot down British fighters over the Mediterranean, battled American bombers over occupied Europe. He had 27 confirmed kills, impressive but not extraordinary in the Luftwaffe, where some pilots had hundreds. He was exhausted. Not just physically, though the constant missions were draining. He was existentially exhausted, tired of killing, tired of watching friends die, tired of the grinding arithmetic of survival where every mission might be your last. But he was also one kill away from earning the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. 28 confirmed kills was the threshold. The medal would bring recognition, respect, possibly assignment away from constant combat. It represented survival. On December 20th, Franz had just landed at a Luftwaffe airfield near Bremen to refuel and rearm. His Messerschmitt Bf-109 was being serviced when the air raid sirens went off, American bombers overhead. He scrambled back into his fighter and took off to intercept. He climbed through clouds searching for targets. The main bomber formation had already passed, but stragglers were still in the area, damaged bombers separated from the protection of the group, limping toward England and safety. These stragglers were easy prey. Wounded animals separated from the herd. Standard procedure was to finish them quickly and efficiently. Franz spotted one, a B-17 flying impossibly low, barely maintaining altitude. As he closed in, preparing to attack, he began seeing details that made him hesitate. The bomber's tail section was shredded, literally transparent in places where metal and fabric had been torn away. One engine was completely gone, just a bare mounting. Another was trailing smoke. The entire fuselage was riddled with holes. He could see inside the aircraft through the damaged sections. Franz pulled alongside, close enough to see into the cockpit. He saw a pilot struggling with controls, face pale with blood loss. He saw the co-pilot slumped forward, possibly dead. He saw gunners in the waist section wounded, not even manning their weapons. Through the holes in the fuselage, he saw something that shocked him, a crew member lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Another crew member hunched over trying to provide first aid. The oxygen system was destroyed. At this altitude, without oxygen, The crew was slowly suffocating. This wasn't a military target. This was a flying coffin full of dying young men trying desperately to get home. Franz had a choice. He could do what every tactical consideration, every military doctrine, every instinct of survival dictated: destroy the bomber, claim his 28th kill, earn the Knight's Cross, or he could do what his brother August had taught him, what Commander Rödel had insisted on, what some deep part of him still believed in. Despite 3 years of war and killing, he could show mercy. Franz Stigler made his choice in an instant. He pulled his fighter alongside Charlie Brown's crippled bomber and tried to signal to the American pilot. Charlie, seeing a German fighter suddenly appear next to him, assumed this was it, the final attack that would finish them. He had no defensive guns operational, no way to fight back. He could only watch as the enemy fighter flew in formation beside them, but the German pilot wasn't attacking. He was gesturing, waving, pointing. Franz was trying to communicate. Land your aircraft. You're over German territory. Land now, become prisoners, get medical attention. Your crew will survive. Charlie didn't understand. Or rather, he understood what Franz was suggesting but couldn't accept it. His crew was dying, but surrendering meant definite capture. Flying toward England meant a slim chance of survival. He'd rather take the slim chance. Charlie shook his head. Kept flying toward the coast. Franz realized the American pilot wasn't going to land voluntarily, which meant Franz had another choice to make: abandon this futile attempt at mercy or commit to protecting this bomber until it reached safety. What happened next defied all logic of warfare. Franz Stigler, Luftwaffe fighter pilot, became the escort for an American bomber flying over German territory. He positioned his Messerschmitt in tactical formation with the B-17, flying close enough that German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground would see the fighter and hold their fire, assuming the bomber was already captured and being escorted to an airfield. This wasn't just mercy, this was active protection. Franz was using his presence, his aircraft, his identity as a German pilot to create a protective bubble around the enemy bomber. If ground forces realized what was actually happening, they might shoot down both aircraft. If other German fighters appeared, they might attack both Franz and the bomber for his betrayal. Franz was risking not just his career, but his life. For 27 minutes they flew together, the crippled American bomber struggling to maintain altitude, the German fighter pacing alongside, a German pilot and an American pilot who couldn't speak to each other, who were supposed to be killing each other. Flying in the strangest formation of the war, Charlie remained in shock, unable to fully process what was happening. His co-pilot, regaining clarity, kept asking, "Why isn't he shooting? Why isn't he shooting?" The surviving crew members, who could see the German fighter hovering beside them, thought they were hallucinating from oxygen deprivation. Franz stayed with them until they reached the North Sea, the boundary between occupied Europe and potential safety. German anti-aircraft guns along the coast could still shoot them down. Franz positioned his fighter to shield the bomber from ground fire, continuing to create the illusion that this was an authorized escort. At the coastline, Franz pulled alongside the bomber one final time. Charlie and Franz locked eyes across the distance between their aircraft. Franz saluted. Not a casual gesture, but a formal military salute. Acknowledgement between warriors, respect between enemies, goodbye between two men whose lives had become impossibly entangled for 27 minutes. Then Franz broke away, rolled his fighter and disappeared back toward Germany. Charlie Brown watched him go, still not fully understanding what had just happened, but understanding enough to know that a German pilot had just saved their lives. The bomber continued across the North Sea toward England. One more engine failed during the crossing. They were flying on a single engine, far below the minimum safe altitude, over water that would kill them in minutes if they crashed. They made it. Barely. The B-17 crash-landed at an RAF base on the English coast. The aircraft was so damaged it was declared unsalvageable and scrapped for parts. That such a wreck had flown at all seemed impossible. That it had flown across Germany and over the North Sea was miraculous. 9 of Charlie's 10-man crew survived. The navigator had been killed in the initial flak barrage, but 9 young men who should have died that day got to go home eventually, when the war ended, because a German fighter pilot had chosen mercy over a medal. Both men survived the war, but they carried December 20th, 1943, with them in very different ways. Charlie Brown returned to combat missions. He was required to debrief his crew about what happened. The interrogation officers didn't believe his story, or rather they believed it but classified it. A German pilot showing mercy to Americans didn't fit the propaganda narrative. The enemy was supposed to be ruthless, fanatical, inhuman. Stories of German humanity were complicated. Charlie was told not to discuss the incident. He followed orders. For decades, he mentioned it to almost no one. Even his wife didn't learn the full story until years after they were married, but the memory haunted him. He would lie awake at night replaying those 27 minutes. Wondering why. Wondering who. Wondering if the German pilot had been punished for his mercy. Wondering if he'd even survived the war. Charlie completed his required missions and went home to West Virginia. He resumed his education, became a State Department Foreign Service officer. He built a normal American life, career, family, community. But part of him remained in that damaged bomber, wondering about the enemy pilot who'd become something else. Franz Stigler's post-war life followed a different trajectory. He never earned his Knight's Cross, never got that 28th kill. He continued flying combat missions until the end of the war, but December 20th had changed something fundamental in him. He never reported the incident to his commanders. To report it would have been to invite court-martial or worse. Mercy toward the enemy wasn't celebrated in the Wehrmacht of 1943. It was treason. After Germany's defeat, Franz emigrated to Canada. Like many German veterans, he wanted distance from the ruins of his homeland, distance from the memories, distance from collective guilt for what Germany had become. He settled in Vancouver, started a business, built a new identity as a Canadian businessman. He never discussed his war service. His children grew up knowing their father had been a Luftwaffe pilot, but he shared few details. The war was a closed chapter, a past that couldn't be changed and didn't need to be revisited. But he thought about that day, about the decision he'd made, about the American bomber he'd escorted to safety instead of destroying. He wondered if they'd made it across the North Sea. He wondered if his moment of mercy had mattered at all, or if the bomber had crashed anyway, rendering his choice meaningless. He wondered if, 40 years later, some American pilot remembered a German fighter that didn't shoot. In 1986, 43 years after the incident, Charlie Brown made a decision. He was 66 years old, retired, and reasonably good health. He'd spent 4 decades wondering about the German pilot. Now, with time available and resources at hand, he decided to try to find him. It seemed impossible. He didn't know the pilot's name, didn't know which unit he'd been assigned to, didn't know if he'd survived the war, or if he'd died in one of the thousands of aerial combats that continued for another 16 months after December 1943. All Charlie had was a date, a location, and a memory. He started writing letters to Luftwaffe veteran organizations in Germany, to military history researchers, to anyone who might have access to German Air Force records from World War II. He placed ads in veteran magazines and newsletters. He described the incident in as much detail as he could remember: the date, the location near Bremen, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the pilot's behavior. The responses were discouraging. Some people didn't believe the story. Others believed it but couldn't help. Records were incomplete. Units had been destroyed. Many pilots had died. Some responses were hostile. Why was an American pilot trying to find a German enemy? Why couldn't he just let the war stay in the past? But Charlie persisted. The search became an obsession, then a mission, then something deeper, a need to close a circle that had been open for 4 decades. In 1989, one of his letters reached a Luftwaffe veterans organization in Vancouver, Canada. The organization published their newsletter to members, including a summary of Charlie's search. Franz Stigler read that newsletter. He read the description of December 20th, 1943. He read about the American bomber crew searching for a German pilot who'd escorted them to safety. His hands shook as he read. He'd thought about that day for 46 years, wondered if the Americans had survived, wondered if anyone remembered. Now he had his answer. Franz called Charlie Brown on the phone. That first conversation lasted over an hour. They compared memories, verified details, the date, the location, the damage to the bomber, The escort to the coast, the final salute, everything matched. Both men were crying by the end of the call. In 1990, Charlie Brown flew to Vancouver to meet Franz Stigler face to face. The reunion was captured on video, two elderly men, tears streaming down their faces, embracing like brothers who'd been separated for decades. Because that's what they were, in a strange way. Brothers forged not through shared experience, but through an impossible choice made across enemy lines. They discovered they had lived parallel lives after the war. Both had married, raised children, built careers. Both had carried the memory of December 20th, 1943, without sharing it widely. Both had wondered for decades about the other person. The friendship that developed over the following years was profound. Charlie and Franz spoke regularly by phone, visited each other multiple times. They gave joint interviews to journalists and historians. They attended military history conferences together. They became advocates for reconciliation between former enemies. They were, by all accounts, genuinely close. Not just two veterans with a shared story, but actual friends who cared about each other's well-being, celebrated each other's families, mourned each other's losses. Franz's children were shocked to learn the full story. Their father, the quiet Canadian businessman who'd rarely discussed the war, had saved the lives of 10 Americans. He'd risked everything for enemy pilots, and he'd carried that secret for nearly 50 years. Charlie's family was equally surprised. The incident they'd vaguely known about turned out to be more dramatic, more significant than they'd understood. The German pilot wasn't just someone who'd spared them. He'd actively protected them at enormous personal risk, for reasons that transcended military logic. The two men collaborated on a book with writer Adam Makos, published in 2012 as A Higher Call. The title came from Franz's explanation of why he'd spared the bomber. He'd felt a higher call than military duty, a moral imperative that trumped orders and tactical advantage. Franz Stigler died in 2008 at age 92. Charlie Brown spoke at his funeral, describing Franz as my brother and the most honorable man I've ever known. Charlie Brown died less than 6 months later, at age 87. Some people said he'd been holding on to say goodbye to Franz, and once his friend was gone, he was ready to follow. They're buried on different continents, but their families remain in contact. The friendship that began at 20,000 feet over Germany in 1943 and was discovered 46 years later continues through their descendants. Understanding Franz Stigler's decision requires understanding what he was risking. In the Wehrmacht of December 1943, showing mercy to the enemy wasn't just discouraged, it could be fatal. German military culture in World War II was complex. The Wehrmacht wasn't the SS. Regular military units often maintained standards of professional conduct even while fighting for a monstrous regime. But those standards were eroding by late 1943. The war was going badly. Desperation was setting in. Mercy was increasingly viewed as weakness or betrayal. If Franz had been seen escorting an American bomber to safety, if another German fighter had witnessed his actions and reported them, he would have faced court-martial at minimum. The charges would have been serious: aiding the enemy, dereliction of duty, possibly treason. The penalties could have included execution. Franz knew this. He made his choice anyway. Why? He offered several explanations over the years. The bomber crew was defenseless. Attacking them would have been murder, not combat. They reminded him of his brother's crashed plane. Commander Rudel's words about maintaining humanity echoed in his mind. He couldn't bring himself to kill men who were already dying. But maybe the simplest explanation is that Franz Stigler saw human beings instead of enemies. In that moment, looking into the damaged bomber and seeing wounded young men trying desperately to survive, he couldn't reduce them to targets. This kind of recognition, seeing the enemy's humanity, is supposedly what military training tries to prevent. Dehumanization makes killing easier. If the enemy is a monster, shooting them is righteous. If the enemy is a frightened 21-year-old from West Virginia, shooting them requires overcoming moral resistance. Franz never fully overcame that moral resistance. Or rather, he overcame it for 3 years of combat, killed in aerial combat, followed orders, served his country. But on December 20th, 1943, the resistance won. He chose to see humans rather than uniforms. Charlie Brown's reaction to Franz's mercy evolved over decades. Initially, immediately after the incident, he was simply grateful to be alive. The why was less important than the outcome. His crew had survived. As time passed and he processed what happened, gratitude mixed with confusion. Why would an enemy pilot risk everything to save them? It didn't fit any narrative Charlie understood about war, about Germans, about how enemies behaved. The official military response compounded his confusion. When he debriefed about the incident, intelligence officers were skeptical. They categorized it as a combat anomaly, filed it away, told him not to discuss it. The implication was clear. This story didn't serve any useful purpose. It complicated the clear narrative of good versus evil, so Charlie stayed silent. But the silence was corrosive. He'd experienced something profound, a moment of connection across enemy lines, a demonstration that humanity could persist even in the midst of industrialized killing. And he couldn't talk about it. This silence characterized many veterans' experiences. World War II soldiers returned home to a nation that wanted heroes and villains, clear narratives and simple lessons. The complicated truths, the fear, the moral ambiguity, the moments when enemies showed mercy, these didn't fit the stories America wanted to tell. Charlie's search for Franz decades later was partly about verification, proving to himself that the incident had actually happened, that he hadn't imagined or romanticized it. But it was also about closure. He needed to know, did Franz survive? Was he punished? Did his choice to show mercy cost him everything? When they finally connected in 1989, Charlie discovered Franz had not only survived, but had built a good life. His mercy hadn't been punished, it had been secret, carried privately for 46 years, known only to Franz himself. This knowledge transformed Charlie's understanding of the incident. Franz hadn't spared them to be recognized as a hero. He'd spared them because it was the right thing to do, regardless of consequences. He'd lived for nearly 5 decades, never knowing if his choice had mattered, if the bomber crew had even survived the flight to England. Franz's mercy was pure in a way that's almost incomprehensible in our modern age of constant documentation and social media validation. He'd done something extraordinary and simply lived with it privately, never seeking recognition, never using it for advantage. The friendship that developed between Charlie and Franz illuminates something rarely acknowledged about combat. The shared experience of war can create bonds, between enemies stronger than those, between compatriots who never fought. Charlie and Franz understood each other in ways their own families couldn't. They'd both experienced the terror of aerial combat. They'd both made split-second decisions with lives in the balance. They'd both lost friends, seen aircraft explode, felt the visceral reality of industrial killing. They could discuss these experiences without explanation or justification. Franz didn't need to explain why he'd hesitated before attacking the crippled bomber. Charlie didn't need to explain the desperation of flying a dying aircraft over enemy territory. They'd both been there. This mutual understanding extended to their complicated relationships with their service. Neither man was a simple patriot who believed their side was entirely righteous. Neither was a cynic who rejected their service as meaningless. They existed in the ambiguous middle, proud of their courage, haunted by their actions, grateful to have survived, burdened by those who didn't. Their friendship scandalized some people. Veterans on both sides questioned why Charlie would befriend a German pilot, why Franz would associate with an American enemy. The simple answer: they'd been enemies for one day in December 1943. They'd been friends in a strange, unacknowledged way for the 27 minutes of that escort. And once they met in 1990, they were brothers for the rest of their lives. The families embraced this friendship. Charlie's children and grandchildren visited Franz in Vancouver. Franz's family hosted Charlie in their homes. Holidays were celebrated together. Birthdays were acknowledged. When one man was ill, the other called to check on his health. This wasn't performative reconciliation for cameras. This was genuine affection between two old men who'd found in each other something they couldn't find anywhere else, someone who understood. The concept of honor in warfare is deeply complicated. Modern warfare, especially World War II's industrial-scale killing, seems to render traditional notions of honor obsolete. How can there be honor in operating a system designed for mass death? Yet Franz Stigler's choice suggests honor can persist even in dishonorable circumstances. Not honor as allegiance to a cause. Germany's cause in World War II was monstrous, but honor as adherence to a code of conduct that transcends tactics and strategy. Franz followed rules that his enemy didn't necessarily follow, that his own military didn't always enforce, that weren't required for victory. He followed them because, as his commander said, you fight by rules to keep your humanity. This is radically different from modern conceptions of warfare where all's fair and victory justifies methods. Franz adhered to limits even when those limits disadvantaged him, even when they cost him the medal he'd been pursuing, even when no one would have known if he'd violated them. The question this raises: was Franz's mercy a betrayal of his comrades fighting and dying against the Americans? Every American bomber that survived to fly another mission would drop more bombs on German cities, kill more German civilians and soldiers. By saving Charlie's crew, Franz potentially contributed to more German deaths. This calculation weighs heavy. It's the trolley problem multiplied across thousands of potential casualties. Does one act of individual mercy outweigh the systemic consequences? Franz's answer, implied in his actions and later statements: he couldn't control the entire war, couldn't solve the moral calculus of mass conflict. He could only control his own actions in specific moments. In the moment of December 20th, 1943, he was facing wounded, defenseless men who posed no threat. Killing them would have been murder, regardless of the larger strategic implications. This is an intensely personal morality, refusing to commit what he considered murder, even if murder might serve a greater tactical purpose. It's the morality of individual conscience superseding orders, strategy, and collective national interest. Some would call this naive. Others would call it the only morality that matters. The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler became moderately well known after A Higher Call was published in 2012. It's been featured in documentaries, discussed in military history circles, referenced in discussions of war ethics. But the core lesson of their story seems to slip past most discussions. We celebrate Franz's mercy, applaud the friendship that developed, find the narrative emotionally satisfying, and then we continue structuring militaries, training soldiers, conducting wars in ways that make Franz's choice nearly impossible to replicate. Modern military training is extraordinarily effective at overcoming the natural human resistance to killing. Through conditioning, psychological preparation, and systematic dehumanization of the enemy, militaries create soldiers who can kill without the hesitation Franz experienced. This is considered progress. Militaries want effective fighters, not warriors who pause at critical moments to consider their enemy's humanity. Mercy in this context is a malfunction to be trained out. Franz Stigler was a malfunction. His military training should have produced a pilot who destroyed the bomber without hesitation, claimed his 28th kill, earned his Knight's Cross. Instead, it produced a man who listened to his dying brother's lessons and his commander's admonition about maintaining humanity. If we truly valued what Franz did, if we genuinely believed his choice represented something worth emulating, we would train soldiers differently. We would emphasize the preservation of humanity, the importance of individual moral judgment, the supremacy of conscience. Over orders, we don't. We celebrate Franz as an exception while systematically trying to ensure future soldiers won't be exceptional in the same way. This contradiction reveals something uncomfortable about how we process war. We want to believe in honor and mercy and the possibility of humanity amid horror, but we also want military effectiveness, which requires reducing soldiers to reliable mechanisms who execute orders without moral hesitation. Franz Stigler represents the tension between these desires. He was an effective fighter pilot, 27 confirmed kills, years of combat service, skilled and dangerous. But he was also a man who maintained enough humanity to choose mercy when everything in his training, his culture, his immediate circumstances said to kill. We don't know how to replicate him. Or rather, we know but refuse to do it, because replicating Franz would mean accepting less efficient, more unpredictable military forces. It would mean trusting individual soldiers to make moral judgments that might contradict orders. Most military commanders would consider this unacceptable, which means Franz's choice remains exceptional rather than exemplary. Both Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler carried survivor's guilt, the psychological burden of living when others died. For Charlie, it was immediate. 9 of his crew survived, but 1 didn't. Why did the navigator die while others lived? Random chance, yes. The cruel mathematics of shrapnel trajectories and seat positions, But survival often feels like it demands justification. Charlie's guilt was compounded by Franz's mercy. They'd survived not just through luck or skill, but because an enemy chose not to kill them. This introduced a debt that couldn't be repaid. Franz had given them their lives. What do you owe someone who gives you your life? Franz's guilt was different but equally heavy. He'd survived the war while many of his comrades hadn't. He'd emigrated to Canada and built a comfortable life while Germany lay in ruins. And he'd spared an American bomber crew that would fly more missions, drop more bombs, potentially kill more Germans. The friendship between Charlie and Franz helped both men process this guilt. They could discuss it with someone who understood the specific weight of surviving combat. They could acknowledge that survival wasn't entirely random, wasn't entirely deserved, wasn't entirely guilt-free, but their friendship also created new dimensions of guilt. As they aged and their story became public, they were celebrated as examples of honor and mercy. This celebration was uncomfortable for both men. Franz particularly resisted being called a hero. He'd done what seemed right in a specific moment. He'd also killed Allied pilots in other encounters. The mercy on December 20th didn't erase those kills. Charlie struggled with similar discomfort. He'd survived when thousands of other bomber crew members hadn't. His survival story was beautiful, the German pilot who showed mercy. Other crews' survival stories were uglier or non-existent. Why did he get the miraculous encounter while others got shot down over the North Sea with no one to remember them? This is the mathematics of war that statistics can't capture. Numbers tell us that 12,000 American bombers were shot down over Europe, that 80,000 American aircrew died or went missing. But numbers don't tell us what it feels like to be one of the survivors who lived because of random chance or skill or inexplicable mercy. Charlie and Franz lived with that knowledge for decades. The friendship they built wasn't just about celebrating their unusual encounter. It was about bearing together the weight of having survived when so many didn't. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008. He was 92 years old. His funeral in Vancouver was attended by family, friends, and one American former bomber pilot who'd flown from Florida to say goodbye. Charlie Brown eulogized Franz as his brother, his friend, the most honorable man he'd known. He described December 20th, 1943, not as the day a German pilot spared an American bomber, but as the day two men recognized each other's humanity across a divide of war and propaganda and national conflict. Charlie returned to Florida after the funeral. His health was declining. He'd been dealing with various age-related ailments for years. But those who knew him said something had changed after Franz's death. He'd lost not just a friend, but the person who understood his most profound wartime experience. Charlie Brown died on November 24, 2008. 8 months after Franz, he was 87 years old. Some of the people close to both men believed Charlie had been holding on to say goodbye to Franz, and once his friend was gone, he had no reason to keep fighting his own decline. Others thought it was simpler. They were two very old men who'd lived full lives, and their deaths close together was just coincidence. But their families knew better. The bond between Charlie and Franz had transcended normal friendship. They'd been connected by an experience so profound, so outside normal human interaction, that losing one meant losing the person who validated the most important moment of your life. They're buried thousands of miles apart. Franz in Vancouver, Charlie in Florida, but their families exchange Christmas cards, attend each other's milestone celebrations, maintain the connection their fathers and grandfathers built. The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about war, honor, and humanity. First truth. War creates situations where doing the right thing requires defying everything you've been trained to do. Franz Stigler's mercy was, by military logic, a failure. He failed to destroy an enemy aircraft. He failed to earn his medal. He failed to maximize German tactical advantage. But by every moral measure that matters, he succeeded. Second truth, the enemy is human. This obvious statement becomes revolutionary in wartime. Propaganda, training, survival instinct, all push toward dehumanizing the other side. Germans are Jerrys or Krauts. Americans are Yanks or Amis. Reducing enemies to caricatures makes killing them easier. But Franz looked into that bomber and saw individual human beings, frightened, wounded, dying. He couldn't unsee that humanity once he recognized it. Third truth, honor is not obedience. Franz Stigler is celebrated now, but his choice to escort that bomber violated orders, military doctrine, and the expectations of his nation. Honor in his case meant choosing conscience over duty. This is a dangerous lesson for militaries to acknowledge, because it suggests soldiers should maintain moral judgment even when that judgment conflicts with orders. Fourth truth, mercy has no strategic value but infinite moral worth. From a military strategy perspective, Franz's decision was meaningless or counterproductive. Those American crew members went home, lived full lives, but their survival didn't alter the war's outcome. Germany still lost. The bomber they flew that day was scrapped for parts and never flew another mission. Franz's mercy didn't change history, it just changed 10 lives. 9 Americans and 1 German who chose to remain human. Is that enough? To change 10 lives? To maintain your own humanity when everything around you is designed to destroy it? For Franz Stigler, the answer was yes. He died knowing he'd made the right choice. Even if that choice cost him recognition, even if it risked his life, even if no one would have known if he'd simply shot down the bomber and claimed his medal. For Charlie Brown, Franz's mercy was a gift that kept giving. Not just the gift of survival, but the gift of knowing that even in humanity's darkest moments, individuals can still choose compassion over cruelty. That recognition sustained Charlie through decades of remembering, wondering, and finally finding the man who'd saved his life. Their friendship, in those final 18 years from 1990 when they reconnected until 8 when they died, represented something rare and precious. It was reconciliation not at the national level, where governments sign treaties and declare conflicts resolved, but at the personal level where it actually matters. 2 men who were supposed to kill each other instead became brothers. Not because they forgot the war or ignored their different sides. They remembered everything. But they chose to define their relationship by that moment of mercy, rather than by the larger conflict that had temporarily made them enemies. This is the lesson their story offers, if we're willing to hear it. In any conflict, no matter how just or unjust the cause, individuals retain the capacity to choose mercy, to see humanity in the enemy, to risk everything for moral choice rather than tactical advantage. Franz Stigler risked his life, his freedom, his honor to save 10 Americans he'd never met and would never see again. Or so he thought for 46 years, until a letter found him in Vancouver and he discovered his mercy had not been forgotten. Charlie Brown spent 4 decades wondering if the German pilot who'd spared them had survived, if he'd been punished, if his moment of mercy had cost him everything. The discovery that Franz had not only survived but had built a good life, that his mercy had gone unpunished, that he'd kept his humanity intact, gave Charlie's survival meaning it might not have had otherwise. Some stories from World War II are about massive battles, strategic turning points, leaders whose decisions affected millions. Those stories matter. They explain how the war unfolded, why certain nations won or lost, what geopolitical factors shaped our modern world. But this story is different. It's about 27 minutes on December 20th, 1943, when 2 pilots recognized each other's humanity across the most absolute divide imaginable, wartime, at altitude with one pilot holding the other's life in his hands. Franz Stigler could have taken that life. Every incentive pushed him toward it. The kill would have been legitimate, justified, rewarded. No one would have questioned it. No one would have even known there was a choice to make. He chose differently. He chose to preserve life rather than take it. He chose to remain human in a situation designed to make humans into killing machines. And 46 years later, because of that choice, 2 old men became friends. Families connected across continents. Grandchildren heard stories about honor and mercy that contradicted everything they'd learned. About World War II from textbooks and movies, the legacy of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler isn't just their story. It's the question their story asks. In our own moments of choice, when power and opportunity align to let us harm others without consequence, what do we choose? Franz chose mercy. Charlie chose gratitude and eventually friendship. Both men chose to live the rest of their lives defined by the best moment of a terrible war, rather than by the worst. They're gone now. The last 2 people who were present in the cockpit of that Messerschmitt and that B-17 on December 20th, 1943. Who knew exactly what happened, who carried the full weight of that encounter. Both are dead, but the story persists. because it offers something we desperately need. Proof that honor can survive dishonor, that humanity can persist amid horror, that enemies can become brothers, that mercy matters even when strategy says it shouldn't. The sound of those engines, the damaged B-17 struggling westward, the Messerschmitt pacing alongside, faded into silence over the North Sea 74 years ago. But the echo of what happened in those 27 minutes continues to resonate. 2 pilots, 2 aircraft, 1 impossible choice, and a friendship that proved mercy matters not despite war but because of it. This is their story. This is what they did. This is why it matters. The enemy who refused to kill, the pilot who never forgot, the 46-year search for meaning, the brotherhood forged from mercy. This is a higher call.